Why do China, Malaysia, Taiwan, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Brunei claim the South China Sea? The South China Sea, the origins and timeliness of the conflict. The South China Sea is an area of great strategic and economic importance, but also a major flashpoint in international relations. The main axis of the conflict involves two small archipelagos, the Paracel Islands and the Spratly Islands. China and its neighbors have been engaged in a territorial dispute over them for several decades, and the scale of the dispute is growing in proportion to the growth of China's role and aspirations. The conflict in the South China Sea is considered one of the greatest contemporary threats to global security, along with issues such as the division of Korea or the Japanese-Russian dispute over the Kuril Islands. It affects China-ASEAN relations and China's bilateral relations with most of its members. It is also an important element in the rivalry between China and the United States over the Asia-Pacific region and a test of changes in the global balance of power between the West and Asia. As it slowly builds its new world and new international order according to its own rules, China wants to know how far it can go. By defining the South China Sea as its zone of exclusive influence, the Middle Kingdom is on a collision course with other countries with access to the body of water. China's neighbors are increasingly active in raising the issue internationally and making their case. The Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague is also involved in the dispute, as the division of territorial waters is governed by maritime law. Meanwhile, China has taken the position that interference in the South China Sea is interference in its sphere of influence. The international community is thus faced with the dilemma of whom to support, while at the same time, everyone has a vested interest in building good and strong relations with the growing rival of the US for global leadership in terms of power, importance, and wealth. China's adversaries, who are at the same time economically tied to it, are in a particularly difficult position. Events in the South China Sea are developing into a deepening instability that also adversely affects Western interests. The United States is closely monitoring the situation in the region, as are the other G7 members, including the 4 EU member states. The importance of the South China Sea. The South China Sea is a vital shipping lane connecting East and Northeast Asia with the Indian Ocean and the Middle East. Nearly 80% of China's energy imports pass through this body of water, as well as most of the trade between Japan, South Korea, and members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and India, Africa, and Australia. About 15% of world trade passes through here, including oil for East Asia. It is estimated that the value of goods transported through the basin reaches $5 trillion annually. The South China Sea is also important from a security perspective. The Spratlys are crucial for access to South Asian ports, and control over them is of great geostrategic importance. At the same time, the South China Sea is a veritable resource basin for East and West Asia. There are oil and gas deposits on the seabed off the disputed archipelagos, but it is not known exactly how much. China's estimate is 17.7 billion tons of oil. For comparison, Kuwait's reserves are estimated at about 13 billion tons. The basin is also rich in fisheries, which could account for up to 10% of the world's fish and seafood. Beijing puts the value of the region's biological wealth at about $1 trillion. Fishing is one of the most important economic activities of the countries in the region, an important part of their national income and the primary income of local fishermen. Territorial claims and conflict escalation. The importance of the disputed territories and the unclear legal status of the archipelagos can pose a threat to security in the region. From time to time, there have been various clashes between the countries involved in the dispute, such as the seizure of fishing vessels by force. Beijing has steadily expanded its sphere of activity, building oil platforms and sending Coast Guard ships and military fighter jets. The escalation of tensions, which has been ongoing since May 2014, could very quickly turn into a large-scale conflict. This would threaten economic stability and the possibility of economic exchange among ASEAN countries, as well as between the West and Asia. In general, China is competing with 5 countries in the 10-member ASEAN for control of the 2 archipelagos. The paracels are the source of the dispute between China and Vietnam, while 6 countries are involved in the dispute over the Spratlys. 3. The People's Republic of China, Vietnam, and Taiwan, which is not recognized as an independent state by most of the international community or by China, claims sovereignty over the entire territory. 3 others, the Philippines, Malaysia, and the Sultanate of Brunei, administer some of the islands. Historical and legal background of claims. Historical issues are playing an increasingly important role in arguing the claims of individual countries. This is particularly true of China. This is also due to the fact that in the post-colonial period, a sense of history, the discovery of one's own cultural past and traditions, has become essential to rebuilding, or in some cases, even creating, one's national and political identity from scratch. For centuries, the South China Sea had been a fishing ground for fishermen from all over the region, and trade flourished. The Chinese dominated the area until the 16th century, then the Europeans, especially the Portuguese, French, Dutch, and British. After the end of World War II, China, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia began to lay claim to parts of the basin. The parties' arguments are based on interpretations of international law, but also have a historical basis. Arguments of China and Taiwan. Beijing cites material evidence dating back to the Tang Dynasty, 618–907 AD, that the area of the Spratly Islands was discovered by Chinese sailors and fishermen. According to the Chinese authorities, this occupation of the islands means that they have always been Chinese territory, and it is only because of their small size that no permanent settlement has been established on them. It is precisely the settlement that is the key issue, since under international law, the mere discovery of an area is not sufficient to claim sovereignty over it. Taiwan's claims to the region are based on the same grounds as those of the authorities in Beijing. Taipei assumes that since there is one China, as the PRC also claims, the discovery of the islands by Chinese sailors is also an argument for Taiwan's right to the region, especially since it was Taiwan that first established a permanent physical presence in the Spratlys, taking advantage of Japan's defeat in World War II and the withdrawal of its troops from Southeast Asia. In 1947, the authorities in Taipei announced their claim and by 1956 had occupied the largest of the Spratly Islands, Ituaba, where Taiwanese soldiers are still stationed. Vietnamese arguments. Vietnam refers to the historical activity in the region of the Vietnamese Nguyen dynasty, from the 17th to the 19th century. Maps and other historical documents attesting to Vietnamese sovereignty over the region were collected by the Vietnamese government and published between 1979 and 1982. The documents mention, among other things, the Gay Bao, a sailor's ceremony commemorating the so-called Paracel Fleet of Li Sun. In the first half of the 17th century, Emperor Nguyen established such a fleet and recruited people from An Vinh Commune, Bin Son District, Quang An Gai Province, to fish and harvest seafood in the islands of the archipelago. In 1813, another emperor proclaimed his dominion over the islands. And in 1834, a Buddhist pagoda was built there, contradicting the Spratlys' cultural affiliation with the Middle Kingdom. Vietnam's claims are also based on earlier French claims. French colonial authorities, seeking to build the Union of Indochina in the 1930s, exploited Vietnam's claims to territories it had sought to colonize for centuries. France sought to expand its political influence, and in 1933 demanded recognition of its sovereignty over the Spratly Islands. After independence in 1949 and reunification in 1975, Vietnam recognized itself as the heir to these claims. Arguments of the Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei. The Philippines points to the activities in the region of Tomas Cloma, a Filipino lawyer and entrepreneur involved in fishing in the South China Sea. In 1947, Cloma discovered unknown and uninhabited islands in the Spratly archipelago. In 1956, he and a group of 40 people took formal sovereignty over them and proclaimed the establishment of the new island state of Kalayaan, Freedom Land. Malaysia bases its claim on historical arguments, but also on its interpretation of international conventions on territorial waters. Brunei makes a similar argument, demanding recognition of its sovereignty over Louisa Reef, part of its continental shelf. However, the Sultanate's situation is complicated by the fact that the same area is claimed by Malaysia, which has controlled the area since 1984. Executive summary. The South China Sea dispute is a complex conflict with both historical and contemporary geopolitical underpinnings. The territorial claims of China, Taiwan, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei are based on different legal and historical grounds, further complicating the situation. The strategic and economic importance of the region means that the dispute has the potential to escalate into a major international conflict with far-reaching consequences for global stability. The international community faces the difficult task of finding a solution that takes into account the interests of all parties and ensures lasting peace in the region. Thank you for watching the video. Leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. See you next video.